So the vast majority of our book festival events are offered without charge, but they are not free to present. And so I would ask that you please consider donating to the City of Literature by visiting iowациtybookfestival.org and clicking on support. So today we will hear from author Jarod K. Anderson. Jarod has 3 best-selling collections of nature poetry: Field Guide to the Haunted Forest, Love Notes from the Hollow Tree, and Leaf Litter. His memoir, Something in the Woods Loves You, which was published this year, explores his lifelong struggle with depression through a lens of love and gratitude for the natural world. Jarod created and voices the Crypto Naturalist podcast, a scripted audio fiction show about real adoration for imaginary wildlife. So please help me welcome Jarod Anderson, who will speak about his book, Something in the Woods Loves You. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming. So, I have about 50 minutes, and I want to leave time for Q&A because that's my favorite part of things like this. But I'll talk for a little bit about me, I'll intro the book, I'll do a little bit of reading, and then I'm going to leave time for questions and do a little bit of signing out there if anyone's interested. Okay, so the first thing I wrote in my notes is, who are you? Nice, easy question to start with. Not huge at all. So I'm from kind of a semi-rural small town in Ohio, right next to what is officially Appalachia. It was only an hour away from Columbus, but Columbus might as well have been Mars. I thought of it as huge and inscrutable and too frightening to visit. And some of my earliest memories are doing daily nature walks with my mom to see what was evolving in the woods, the spring ephemerals coming up, learning how to make tea from sassafras, finding baby green herons and helping to get them rehabilitated. And I was sort of an odd liminal character in the town I was from. I kind of walked borderlands between extremes. I was one of those kids that was put in the gifted program, but then also pulled aside for learning disabilities and dyslexia and ADHD at a time when there were not a lot of resources for those kind of issues. Also, I think I was confusing in terms of traditional gender roles. One example I like to give is I once had to miss football practice because I won a state poetry award, which was very confusing, I think, to a lot of the people in the town I grew up. But I've always loved language, I've always loved nature, and as long as I can remember, I've struggled with chronic major depression and suicidal ideation. And I don't recall, this is how stigma works, I don't recall internalizing the stigma that I was not supposed to talk about any of those things, but I internalized that stigma. And so I was well into my 30s before I was in a position to really acknowledge the disease that was threatening my life. And I had a winding track, which might not be shocking with the little background I've given you so far, but I went to college as a non-traditional student. Neither of my parents attended college. Hated it right off the bat and left, and then went back later when I was older and had worked for a while and had more of an understanding that I was a book nerd and that was the place for me. Did a bachelor's, master's, taught English for a while at a high university and realized that I liked academia in theory, but that I could leave academia and still read books and write, and nobody would stop me. So I found my footing really in the nonprofit world. And then I started kind of accumulating what I thought of as my shoulds. I started kind of following all of the external pressures that I thought would guarantee some kind of external validation of success. So I had a job where I was a coordinator, and then I had a job when I was as a manager, and then I had a job as a director. And that job was really where I hit a nadir in terms of depression. Because in all the past positions, I could think, okay, I'm unhappy, but that's because I'm on a road to something. I'm becoming. But in the director position, I thought to myself, okay, here I am. This is what I'll be doing for the next 40 years. And it was a real crisis, especially in terms of suicidal ideation. And I had the immense privilege of a partner who said, okay, screw that job, just leave. And eventually that's what I did. And then it was a shock and a terror to find that didn't fix everything. But in that year, as a director, I started to really return to my creative life and my creative passions. And as I sat in meetings about meetings, I thought to myself, okay, this is smothering me. What would I do creatively if I could do literally anything I wanted? And I tried to willfully and intentionally reject a chance at prestige, or external validation. And where I started was this silly little podcast called The Crypto Naturalist that just combined a couple of my loves, which was single-voice nature shows. I grew up obsessed with shows like Wild America with Marty Stauffer, which was this bearded guy from Tennessee that would go into swamps and pull up snapping turtles. I just love that guy. He was sort of pre the crocodile hunter. And fantasy. I just love fantasy. I was a Tolkien kid. I just loved the wizards and dragons. And so I thought, all right, I'm going to bring the enthusiasm of a Marty Stauffer, but I'm going to leave fact completely behind and instead embrace enthusiasm. So that was the podcast. And I started to grow a bit of a listenership and a bit of a social media presence. And I've been a nature poet since I was 10, and so I constantly write nature poetry. And my online brand became more and more confusing because, yes, I would talk about my strange little fiction podcast, but I would also post scraps of poetry about nature and mental health. And I had this sort of bifurcated audience where there were poetry fans that would follow me and they didn't know or care that I had a podcast. And there were podcast fans that would follow me and I think they found the poetry inscrutable. But as that grew, people started reaching out to me and saying, hey, I'd really like to hold a physical copy of your poetry collections. So then I pursued publication and did Field Guide to the Haunted Forest, which was very popular, and that led me to do another collection and another. And this was really kind of culminating alongside a realization that I had to acknowledge how rough my mental health had become. And shortly after I had left the job and started to grow the audience, a publisher reached out to me from Timber Press, which is a cool publisher that does fun nature stuff. They're a Hachette imprint, and said, hey, have you ever thought about doing nonfiction? Well, indeed I had. Enough folks had reached out to me about their own mental health, and they wanted to talk shop, is the way I had thought of it, based on all of my poems about depression. And talking to my wife, I started to talk about this concept of the long talk that I wanted to have with these folks. And, I couldn't have the long talk in Instagram DMs. It just wouldn't work. So it became clear to me that this needed to be a book. And Timber reached out and asked me, and I said, all right, well, funny you should ask. And I sent them an outline and first few chapters, and then I hesitantly signed a contract that would make me actually finish this memoir, which was great, because I think we all need deadlines sometimes. But they offered me this book deal, and there was a bit of terror that I had taken on writing a book about nature and mental health, which were just massive, abstract concepts. It's like, okay, well, there's no shortage of things to say here, but that's not really the problem. The problem is, what organizing principle am I going to use so that I don't flounder in topics this giant? And it occurred to me that the hard year where I left the director position at Ohio University could be my structure, especially as I understood more and more how I could take a gentle approach in thinking about my pain and depression if I sought metaphors of understanding in nature. So that year's seasons, the creatures that meant something to me, the trees, became the structure of the book. So the book is structured in 4 seasons, starting in winter, which was my real low point with depression. And I followed the track of that year, which became helpful to me in terms of thinking about the cyclical nature of my mental illness. And it's funny, I wanted to be so careful with this book, not to be one of those people that said, go out and touch a tree and you'll feel better. Because anybody who struggles with depression has this real sense of the toxic positivity out there that I think people bring to you in a well-meaning way, but it just is dismissive, and that's what it feels like. That said, I want to read a little passage about how going and touching a tree made me feel better. Don't worry, I complicate it. But it's interesting. A lot of the early struggle was I knew that there were treatments for depression, and I knew that people took medication and helped them. But I constantly said to myself that was for other people. Because depression defends itself, and depression lies to you. And it is profoundly difficult to think of your own perspective as a symptom of an illness. And so early in the process, what really helped me was just reconnecting with something I loved, something that felt fundamental to my identity, and that was nature. And thankfully, my wife would say, hey, go. And I did not appreciate it. But she would get me to go out in the woods. And from that, that's what really allowed me to start rejecting the feeling depression lays on your doorstep that pleasure is impossible, or that pleasure is something simply intellectual and locked in the past. So this little passage is about one such time when Leslie urged me into the woods. And this is from the chapter called Shagbark Hickory. It was a chilly, wet 11 a.m. on a weekday in October. There was nobody at the park. Why would there be? Other people have real jobs. Depression always has a comment. I didn't want to be there, but I was committed to running a small experiment. I wanted to see if it was possible to have a miserable, successful day. Whether I like it or not, all my versions of success require effort. It's one of my old beliefs, and I can bend it, but not break it. Human worth is innate. Success means overcoming resistance. It means work. The air was crisp and misty. I trudged through squelching mud, churning red and gold leaves down into the hungry earth. On that walk, I didn't feel happy with either my beliefs about success or the day's experiment. But I asked my legs to move, and they did. One more commonplace miracle. Moment by moment, stubborn step by stubborn step, I reached the shagbark hickory. I reached out to the rough bark. The cold, wet, depressed, and contrary part of my mind wanted to be cynical about the tree and dismissive of its presence. I wanted to mock myself as a cliche, a crunchy New Age fake. I wanted to call the day a waste. But that part of me fell silent when my fingers met the tree. Here was 80 feet of hickory, over a century of life, turning dirt and pale Ohio sunlight into food I could eat straight from the ground, into the oxygen I'd been breathing since before I knew what breathing was. There was no ignoring it. I could feel it there, really feel it, alive, electric beneath my aching fingers. an ancient creature, silent and grand, beside a crooked little footpath. Family. That hickory stood tall over me, and for a moment it was the only tree in the woods, the only tree in the world, the first tree, the last tree, the concept of a tree. I tried to calculate its value in that moment and saw how absurdly useless the word value is when applied to nature, like trying to pin a price tag on rain or sunlight or gravity. I tried to imagine the tree as human technology, and suddenly I was standing in the presence of an impossible work of science fiction, a solar-powered, self-replicating, carbon-fixing automaton producing oxygen and building materials on a planetary scale. I tried to shift genres, fantasy and magic, and I found I was a small, fleeting pilgrim who walked in the shadow of giants, living off of their size. How much of my own form and evolution was quietly shaped by trees, an opposable thumb for climbing, shelter and refuge from predators, fuel for cooking, unlocking more nutrients to build a larger brain. I know that touching a tree does not cure depression. Of course I know that. I also know that on that October day, the hickory didn't need to cure my depression in order to take away its power. That tree connected me with all trees, with our big world and our long shared history. It brought me outside on a day when my inner life had become small and smothering. The bark of the tree was wet and cold, and the touch of it still filled me with wonder and warmth. My realization about the tree, the fundamental aspects of its form and history, the meaning we made together, would not be brushed aside by gray weather or one season's depression. Those thousands of pounds of living wood, soaring branches, deep delving roots, aren't defined by any one challenge or hardship, not by an illness or injury or countless other vicissitudes of time and chance. The roots it grew through 100 autumns have lasted the most bitter of winters. There's a Nordic saying about weather that I dearly love. There is no bad weather, only bad clothes. The shame of my mental illness often hits hardest when I find myself falling short of my own expectations. The thing is, in the tension between ability, illness, and expectations, it is clear which element I can most easily manipulate, my expectations. I cannot control the weather, but I can dress for it. I cannot always control my depression, but I can control the ways I choose to mitigate it and contextualize it. In this sense, I like to think of the ups and downs of my mental illness as brain weather. If I plan a picnic and I need to abandon that plan because of a sudden thunderstorm, I may be disappointed, but I wouldn't be ashamed. The arrival of that thunderstorm was not my fault. I did not cause or invite it. The same is true for mental illness. Why feel shame because of challenges beyond our control? The brain weather metaphor is helpful in another potent way. Weather, good or bad, is not malicious. That thunderstorm that canceled my picnic is not my enemy. The thunder and lightning didn't spring from a grudge against me personally. Weather is a natural phenomenon and does not have intent. My illness is no different. I didn't choose depression. I didn't summon it. It doesn't hate me, and it isn't willfully harming me. It's a known, widely observed, natural phenomenon. It's weather. Natural hardships, like storms or depression, aren't punishments, and they don't speak to our merit or shortcomings. They are neither justice nor injustice. We don't own or invite them. They aren't evidence of anything. We can sharpen our forecasts and acquire more hard weather gear, but there is no blame to be assigned or rebuke to be deciphered in our struggles to stay warm and dry. My depression, like weather, is a natural thing. and natural things follow seasons and cycles. Learning this was, itself, a new way for me to dress for my inclement mental weather, a new raincoat hanging by the door. It's interesting. I think I find nature healing in terms of my depression for a variety of reasons. One of them is just the physicality in going to nature. Since I love it, since it's a passion of mine, when I go out in the woods, it just engages all of my senses in a physical, concrete way. Meanwhile, depression, I sometimes like to talk about akin to a poltergeist. It's the feeling that it can hit me, like it has solid fists, but then when I reach for it, it's smoke. It's abstract. But when I'm out in the woods, I don't have an encounter with the concept of a chipmunk. I have an encounter with a chipmunk. I'm brought back to the present. It's not a panacea, and I'd never want to talk about it like it is in this book. In fact, I've said before, nature is my path back to passion and interest. It doesn't need to be yours. But something that rang true for me again and again as I made progress fighting depression was this idea that contentment is a skill. Medication, when I finally built up the courage to listen to the people who loved me and try it, was very helpful to me. Cognitive behavioral therapy was very helpful to me. But in a sense, these things brought me up to neutral. There's this paradoxical seeming truth that when very depressed people find success with medication, the risk of suicide is increased. Why? Well, because suddenly you have more energy and clarity. But energy and clarity aren't meaning. There's still the question of, so what? Why? Why do I want to be here? Why does any of it matter? And that isn't a question of medicine, it's a question of meaning. It took me a while to think about the idea that facts don't have built-in meaning. They all have a shadow that says, so what? I love nature facts, but it would be ridiculous for me to say everybody should learn nature facts and that would fix anybody's sense of ennui. No. Love of nature is part of my identity. It's interesting. I think I can change what I think. I can change my opinion on things, but there is this sort of interesting lower layer of belief that I think gets its claws in us kind of young. And that can be daunting, but we can also use it to our advantage. I had the belief that nature is an intrinsic part of who I am, and I could use that. So, as I began to find success fighting depression, more energy, more clarity, I could listen to an old internal voice that said, go to the trees. And part of it was giving myself permission, to love what I love. In the book, I use the word whimsy. I like the word whimsy. And I kind of define it as enthusiasm and joy for enthusiasm's sake. It's sort of joy that refuses to defend itself with practicality. And for me, that is nature, it's imagination, it's creativity. But all of it took intention. It was scary to see a doctor. It was scary to shop for a therapist. And then, in the end, it was also scary to give myself permission to make this kind of meaning, to take whimsy seriously, to take imagination seriously. I want to read one more little excerpt here, trying to be sensitive of the time. The truth is, I need whimsy to live. I suspect many of us do. I need to wander through insectile constellations and fields beneath the dull copper glow of a summer sunset. I need to chat with maples and share meaningful moments with herons. I need to see myself as a dark, warm wilderness through the perspective of my gut bacteria, or an inscrutable striding giant through the senses of a jumping spider on my kitchen counter. These are whimsical imaginings, but important all the same. Important because perspective informs our reality, and our choices inform our perspective. Choosing fun and wonder isn't an impractical, passive escape. It is a valuable, active method for enriching our days, an intentional way to invest ourselves in the premise that life is rich and worth our attention and effort. I need to zoom in to the swirl of my fingerprints and see them as living maps of galaxies, or zoom out and see the water in my body as part of a continuous abstract river flowing from storms over a blooming meadowland down to a midnight seabed where giant spider crabs pace the darkness beneath darting flashes like living lightning, bioluminescence from creatures they do not name, while, high above, whale shadows drift across the liquid sky like passing clouds. There's a dim, gray cavern at the center of me that is neither lit nor warmed by practicality, but whimsy can build a bright hearth there and make it into a home, both for myself and for those who would enter my life. It's the furthest thing from frivolous. I think we all have tool sets to define meaning in our lives, to figure out why it matters to be here. For mine, it's nature, it's connection, it's imagination, it's whimsy. And I like to think part of the reason I wrote the book is that a lot of us can have parallel paths. And it's my hope that explaining how I found my path can be helpful to others. As somebody who struggles with major depression, the idea of selling books doesn't really do it for me to get to the keyboard. But the idea that I might be doing some kind of act of service does. Another reason the book starts with winter and ends in autumn is the idea that I never find the answer for depression, and that making peace with that is part of the answer. It starts in winter when I'm at my worst, and then in terms of the narrative of my path to healing, I get some tools in spring. And then in summer, I think I get a little cocky that, oh, I got this. I figured this out, you know. I did the work, and now I know what medication works for me, and oh, I get it. I'm not even sure I need to go to therapy anymore. I think I pretty much have it. And then in autumn, it's realizing that, oh, here it comes again. And that that's okay. And that rejecting the shame of relapse is a huge part of my own path in victory. Otherwise, for years, for decades, I think I would refuse to acknowledge depression. I would get to some kind of plateau where I thought I had enough coping strategies and masking strategies to get away with it. And then I would be crushed when I would have a bad spell. And one of the things that I think I've come to that have been really helpful to me at this place in the journey is that I really feel like I have disrupted that cycle. Partly by acknowledging that it's a cycle, by understanding that I can think of my internal landscapes as weather, as seasons, by embracing that nature metaphor, both as the source of meaning making for my so what on the good days, and a teacher on the bad days. That it's okay to have rainy seasons, it's okay to have storms and inclement weather. And there's no reason for me to think I should be doing it more perfectly than the natural world. And I think that's been huge for me. Okay. I would love to take some questions, if anybody has any for me.
Hang on.
Oh,
We're live streaming the talk, so we want to use the mic.
oh, look at you. Okay, cool.
Hi, this question is just kind of clarifying. When you said you like to take walks with your mother, was that when you were a child or as an adult?
It was when I was a child. Those were some of my earliest memories. She's in kind of poor health, so she can't really walk in the woods anymore, but I would still absolutely love to walk in the woods with my mother. I don't think of it as a child thing. Yes, yeah. And now I have a 5-year-old son named Arthur, and I've started taking him. Yeah. Others. I'll also say that having a 5-year-old in the woods with you he's an interesting teacher for me, you know. I'll see him shake with excitement over seeing a bumblebee, you know. And I can, you know, I write nature poetry quite a bit, but I can't quite capture that feeling. He's also, you know, the podcast, the fiction podcast, was always meant as a metaphor. Because when you're a kid, you can hear about electric eels. And Arthur heard about electric eels, and he came up to me and said, "Is that real?" And it's like, wow, that's just a really fair question. And yes. And so the metaphor for the podcast is reaching for the fantastical to remind adults that commonplace nature is fantastical. And switching back and forth is a little bit of a trick I do in the podcast too. Every once in a while I just drop some actual nature facts, but I like to keep people kind of on a back foot, not knowing if I'm doing fiction or nonfiction. Others?
Are you familiar with the term touch grass, and what do you think about it?
I am. I'm not a huge fan in that I feel like it weaponizes the thing that I'm trying to gently talk about. The idea of coming to nature to center yourself and, you know, as a grounding technique, using that as some sort of insult strikes me as, oh, I don't know, kind of not super helpful for the conversation, I think.
My question is, do you feel like the ideology you employ in your memoir came as a product of writing the book, or do you think that like the messages that you had were always kind of with you?
Yeah, a little of both. The book was partly informed by actual conversations I had by people. Things that maybe I didn't even know needed said. Like I've received more than one message from somebody that essentially said, I would like to go to nature, but I don't know how to do it correctly, which I found heartbreaking. Like the idea that if you didn't know the names of the trees you were seeing, that it wouldn't count. But I also had a stack of notes of just things I wanted to say, that things I noticed or were an epiphany for me in my own journey. So part of it came from conversations, part of it from my own notes, and part of it through just the magic of writing it all down, finding new connections. I mean, again, I was really a little terrified going into the project with the size of the concepts I was trying to talk about. I mean, meaning of life, nature, mental health. So putting layers upon layers of limits on it was how I was able to do it at all. I'm going to do a year. Each chapter is going to be named after a plant or animal I have a specific connection and anecdote about. But through the process of doing it, I found new connections and new things to say about. So yeah, I always like to say I don't really know what I think until I write it down. So this was part of that. Yeah.
As the books come out, have you heard from people or, I don't know, learned from others with maybe not a depression diagnosis, but other diagnoses, anxiety, eating disorders, schizophrenia, affective disorder, that other people have found that nature has helped them navigate what they're dealing with?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's a big family, neurodivergence. And so, you know, I talk to a lot of folks, and sometimes we find points of commonality, and then I think everybody in the conversation, when I participate, finds it fascinating when they diverge, when one thing helps me that might not, for example, help my wife that has major anxiety. And so, you know, like much of nature, and, you know, brains are utterly natural. It all sort of falls on an interesting spectrum rather than tidy little boxes. And it's been interesting and educational to me to find where paths diverge and come together. But yeah, quite a few folks have reached out to me and said, you know, this is my diagnosis and this is how I bring it to my love of nature. And that's been one of the great joys of publishing the book, is those sorts of connections that have arisen. Yeah. Any others?
I apologize for coming late, and I haven't read your book, but I'd like to know if you work with younger children in groups, or just because you have a 5-year-old.
Yeah. So I've been a bit of a chicken about it. I would like to. I volunteer with local park systems and with a teaching farm, an organic farm that brings field trips out. And they've been bugging me too, and I'm gonna. I think it's important. I just, you know, I taught college English for a few years, and I'm a little terrified of middle schoolers, though. And that's sort of the age group we're talking about. Just in my own life, I feel like that was when kids learned how to be mean. So even though I'm like 43, I'm just like, I don't know. Okay, all right. There are elementary school trips, so I may try that. Thank you. Preschool? Yeah, I love preschoolers, yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Apologies, I won't be word perfect with this, but I've always sort of thought of at least my own experience as if you can put a face to it, you can face it better. Sort of if you know what you're up against, you can do better to find things that create your own meaning, to at least acknowledge what's going on if you can't quite fix it. Yeah. And I know you were able to find that passion and connection with nature from a very, I guess, maybe it became more clear as you spent more time with it. But for those of us sort of still wandering in between passions, not really knowing what to look for, how were you able to sort of know that that was like that striking moment and encourage others to sort of who feel more aimless or listless within their own mental experiences find that spark for them?
Yeah. One thing that was helpful to me was kind of looking to my childhood, sort of what did I like when I wasn't feeling a bunch of external pressures to like the correct things. I feel like that voice was helpful to me. And I would also say, I think it's important to reject the one thing kind of take, that like, if I just find the thing, and instead kind of, you know, I like this sense of imaginative empathy and curiosity and just being open to joy wherever you find it, rather than trying to craft like a thesis statement of identity, which ends up feeling like another kind of pressure to be perfect in your own messy process of meaning making. So, you know, I think the childhood voice is helpful to me. I think the what do I want to do today kind of mindset is good. Not how do I want to craft a life, but where am I drawn to joy today? and get sort of the zoom in rather than getting the big questions out of your head sometimes, I think is really helpful. But, you know, and I like to think of identity as a living document too. Like, this isn't a problem to solve in a certain sense. It's going to be an evolving organic thing, and that is beautiful and okay. And just one practical thing, write stuff down. Like, if you struggle with meaning making, mental illness, all of it can be so abstract, it is hard to have a conversation with a concept. So if you can articulate it and write it down, I've found that immensely helpful to me. Yeah.
Hi, I really enjoyed your presentation, and your writing is very beautiful.
Thank you.
I'm sort of intrigued by your whimsy, your focus on whimsy, and I'm wondering if synchronicities have come up for you in your openness to whimsy, and if they've provided any guidance.
Synchronicities in what sense? Like parallel kind of interests?
I'm thinking of synchronicity, like coincidences, meaningful coincidences.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for a long time, I was sort of science-minded in the way that wanted to deeply reject any kind of magical thinking. And I have since really gone far astray from that, especially when I think of, you know, to myself that meaning making is utterly subjective. And so, you know, meaning is where I find it and craft it. So I can give you one example. The first walk I took in the woods when I was really starting down this path, I went out in the woods, and one of the main things I was feeling was guilt, that I was wasting time, and I would see trees that I know I should know the name of, and I didn't, and my mom would be upset with me. And I don't know if I thought there was a quiz waiting for me in the parking lot. But I turned a corner, and there was this broad, shallow stream, and there was a great blue heron. It always tears me up to talk about this one. But I saw it, and it just made me cry standing there. And it was a sense that I thought that nature was kind of a juvenile thing, and it was locked behind glass, like this glass case of childhood or the past. And going out and seeing the heron, it was like, oh, it's still here. So that was one of those moments for me. Yeah. All right, well, I will go sit at a table right there if anybody wants to chat more. Or have
Thanks
anything
so
to
much
say.
for your great talk today.
Thank you.